Welcome back to Impossibly Unremarkable, a podcast hosted by myself, Jonathan Butts, and my longtime friend, co-host, and future dad-to-be, Elliott and Jonathon.
That is right. We're back for another episode. And if you're listening to this, you most likely rose up this morning, smiled at the rising sun, and now you see three little podcasters pitched on your doorstep. That is right, three. Today, we are joined by the very talented and special guest, Michael Callahan. He is a master of storytelling and the host of the Where We Go Next podcast, a podcast where Michael speaks with a variety of accomplished guests about their expertise, their passions, and it always leads to open, honest, and informative discussions. Welcome to the podcast, Michael.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for having me on, and congrats on being a father-to-be.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, it is definitely a topic that has consumed our podcast the last few weeks because I cannot stop talking about it. It's the only big thing going on in my life. But yeah, we can start off with your search history, Michael, if you are open to that. Just kind of give us a little peek into your brain. What's going on in the life of Michael Callahan? What's going on in your search history?
First of all, I apologize for my exotic last name. It is a bit difficult to pronounce. So I'll take ownership of that.
No, it's okay. I should be getting it. I keep adding a D at the end for some reason. I don't know what my problem is.
He literally does this to every single guest.
Quite all right. You know, my actual ancestral family name was spelled with an O at the beginning, and then it had a G in it. The O got lopped off when my ancestors came over in like the late mid 1800s, and then in the early 20th century, I think it was my great grandfather got tired of people pronouncing a hard G in the name, so he just removed it.
Oh wow!
So there's a long history of the name being pronounced various ways.
Callahan, like Irish or?
Yes, yeah. Callahan is Irish. Irish on my father's side, Armenian on my mother's side.
Oh, wow, nice. I know my last name changed when they did the whole like Ellis Island thing. I think it used to be, or I don't know if this is completely true, but I heard there was a rumor in my family. My last name's Markson. There used to be a Von at the beginning, like Von Markson, because it's German, but they dropped the Von because I don't know, because they moved to the Americas.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, anti-German sentiment in the early 20th century was like crazy high. Like anti-German bigotry was wild. Like to the point where there used to be like German settlements in the Midwest, like in places like Cincinnati and other parts of the Midwest, where there were entire towns that spoke nothing but German. If you were an English speaker and walked down the street, you would feel foreign in that environment. But during World War I, there was such crazy anti-German sentiment, like German Americans just being beaten in the streets, that over the next like few decades, all like German speakers, like in those Midwestern towns, like all kind of self-imposed let's not speak German anymore. Wow. Because the anti-German sentiment was so high. So to this day, you have like a lot of almost invisible Germans because a lot of their last names were changed. They're not connected to their culture anymore because they kind of intentionally suppressed it because they were worried about discrimination.
Oh, that's interesting. That's crazy. He's already dropping knowledge on us today. Look at this.
Actually, in college.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
In college, I took a course. It was a very, very specific course called German Immigration to Wisconsin. And it was, to be quite honest, a very dry semester of learning about, immigration and migration patterns and, all the history of, different towns in Wisconsin. But I actually had done a research paper for my final project in that class, talking about the treatment of German Americans during World War I. And what I can say is, at the end of the class, the professor said, this wasn't a very good research paper. So, Michael, I wish you were there to guide me along that journey.
Well, if anything, in college, I was an expert at writing flowery worded English papers like in the last 12 hours before they were due. So I might not have helped you fight procrastination, but I would have made whatever you wrote sound quite nice.
There you go. Awesome.
As far as search history, I will say my search history might be as dry as that German course because the last thing that I researched was for a podcast that I hosted yesterday for my podcast. I spoke with the co-founder and CEO of Stoke Space. calling it a SpaceX competitor wouldn't quite be right because they're making different kinds of rockets for different purposes, but they're looking to make the first fully reusable rocket. So right now, if you think of SpaceX and you think of reusability, it's kind of partially right? Like the stage 1 of SpaceX is reusable, like the Falcon 9, or before that, some of the Falcon 1 rockets. And then upcoming Starship will be fully reusable, but that's a couple years away, and it's a massive rocket that's looking to go to Mars. But in terms of the kind of rockets that are used just to go to space to, let's say, send up satellites or crew members to the ISS, only the first stage of the 2 stages of the rocket is reusable. And then the second stage is, just kind of abandoned and burned up in the atmosphere or dropped into the ocean. So Stoke Space is looking to make not just the first stage of the rocket, the big booster that takes it up to the atmosphere, but also the second stage, the stage that contains the payload, the satellite that goes to space. They want that to be able to come back to Earth as well, not just because if we want true reusability, we need to make the whole thing reusable, but also they want to achieve a rather ambitious goal of 24-hour turnaround time between launches. Right now, the fastest turnaround time is 21 days, and that's SpaceX. So technically, they can refurbish an engine, that being SpaceX, they can refurbish a booster in 9 days, but then there's an additional, I can do my math here, 12 days of inspection and just prepping the engine to go again. But with Stoke Space, they're looking for a 24-hour turnaround time. So it was a really deep dive. I had a great conversation with Andy Lapsa. He's the CEO. But most of my search results over the last week or two is mostly just how do rockets work? Basically variations of the how do I not sound like an idiot when I'm talking to a literal rocket scientist? And I find that happens a lot with my show is I'm wouldn't it be cool to talk to an expert on this? It's all really fun when I'm sending out the cold email and I'm like, man, it would be amazing. And then they say yes. And then it's just weeks of terror because I realize that oh my God, I've signed myself up to ask seemingly intelligent sounding questions to someone who is just infinitely smarter than me, especially in this field. And now I have to not sound like an idiot. And so it's just me frantically for weeks, just being how do I sound what, And so that's most of my search history.
You said it's Stoke Space?
Yeah, Stoke Space, Stoke. Funny enough, I'm not entirely, I don't entirely know why they call it Stoke Space, but one of my friends was like, is it because they're stoked to go to space, bro? And
heck yeah.
I like that idea.
Interesting. I've never heard about them, but I mean, I'll be honest, looking through your very thorough portfolio so far, I'm just jealous of, all the different people you've gotten to speak with. And one of the questions I had, and maybe this is getting a bit too deep, but throughout this process, you've talked to comedians, filmmakers, lawyers, professors, authors, CEOs, everyone. But is there any particular field or any kind of study or specific profession that you just really want to know more about and you haven't gotten the chance to?
I mean, I've got the people I absolutely would love to talk to one day but I'm not sure would ever come on. I would love to speak with Sean Evans, the host of Hot Ones.
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
Mostly because the thing that I love talking to people about, regardless of what industry they're in, is what is the inciting incident of why you do what you do? Why are you passionate about what you're passionate about? Because for me, finding out the why, it can explain a lot of what drives that person, and right. Maybe it's for me, I became interested in storytelling. I can trace back the very first memory I had. I was 3 years old. I was sitting on the floor of the new townhome my parents had just bought. I remember the boxes were still unpacked, and I was sitting on the floor with my dad. He had a typewriter out, and I would dictate superhero stories to him, and he would write them out on his typewriter, his little click-clacky typewriter, and then he would read those stories back to me. And me hearing my own father, who when you're 3 years old, that's your hero, hearing my hero read my own stories back to me in his voice was hypnotic. It was an incredibly powerful thing because it gave my little Ninja Turtle stories a kind of legitimacy because he was reading them. And from that age, I really fell in love with storytelling. I started writing short stories and entering story contests and then practicing journalism and then going to film school. And it all kind of started there. And so for me, I love whether it's a scientist, a host of a Hot Wings show. Who else do I have? I talked with Dan Bulick and Pat Brennan. They're the co-hosts of Console Wars. I'll be doing a special episode again with them coming up where we all kind of talk about our favorite 16-bit video games. Or whether it's Who else? Who are some people I would love to have on? Let's see here. I mean, Jonathan Haidt. He's the writer, the co-author of The Coddling of the American Mind with Greg Lukianoff and the chair of the Heterodox Academy. He's this great thinker about like the importance of things like free speech and why it's like free expression is important, and how oftentimes we need to really think through things in public in like a reasoned way in order to actually understand each other and understand what the best path forward might be. But I haven't been able to have him on. Or like Chris Williamson. He's the host of the Modern Wisdom podcast. I messaged him. He's a super busy guy. I might never hear from him. And the thing is about this too, and I'll stop ranting after this, is like, I'm never like miffed. I mean, I'm, sad if I don't get to talk with someone, but I'm sad about a lot of things. I'm sad I'm not 6'5". I'm sad I'm not able to bench 1,000 pounds. But for me, it's like, you email 20 people, you get one yes, Yeah. It's really a numbers game. There are so many people I'd love to talk to of all backgrounds, but mostly I think the binding materials, I just really like what makes people tick and why people are interested in what they're interested in. That really excites me.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, and you do a really good job of it. I mean, your podcast is really good. You're good at asking crazy good questions. Like you said, obviously there's a lot of research that goes into it. How much time do you spend doing that research? Like you said, like you don't want to sound stupid when you're interviewing these like super intelligent, like experts in their field. Like how much time do you put into that? Like when you're gathering research for your questions?
It really depends on the guest, right? So funny enough, if I'm interviewing someone where actually, let me do that again. So it depends on the guest, and it actually depends on the goal that I have for the podcast, because my goals change, right? So, for instance, when I spoke with Monica Gandhi, she is the head of. I want to get her title right. Let me actually just pull it up. She is. I've got her bio here. She is the professor of medicine and associate division chief of the Division of HIV, Infectious Diseases and Global Medicine at UCSF. I brought her on to talk about the mRNA COVID vaccines back in 2021 when they were first being rolled out. Because for me, obviously not to get too political, but everything's political these days. Sure. To me, I had friends who were either really vax hesitant at the time, or I had friends who were just like terrified of COVID and like weren't coming out of their house, and like I missed my friends and wanted to see them, So I had Monica come on because I wanted her to explain like, this is what they do, this is what mRNA is, don't be scared, like here this stuff's been tested for decades, like. And so with something like that, funny enough, even though that's a super, super complex field, I wanted my role in that episode to be the person who's asking the questions any layperson would ask. And so to do that, I didn't have to do as much research as if like my goal with the one with Andy Lapsa, yes, I did want like the layperson to understand it, but I also wanted to dig deep into like, well, okay, if you're using this approach for reusability for stage 2, and it's that simple as you're explaining it to me, like everything he was explaining to me made sense, right? I anticipated that I would want to ask a follow-up that would say, okay, well, why hasn't anyone else done this? But then when I started Googling, why hasn't anyone else done what Stoke is doing, that you just go down a rabbit hole where all of a sudden you're like 3 hours in, you're reading about ceramic tiles and like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster of 2003. And like you just go down a rabbit hole, the thing that causes you to spend that much time is when you try to get to first principles, right? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Urban and all. He's the writer of Wait But Why.
Yeah. I just listened to your episode with him.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
So he is a super, super smart dude. But the reason that it took him 6 years to write his most recent book, this 500-page amazing book called What's Our Problem? A Self-Help Book for Societies, is because like he's a first principles thinker. But first principles thinking is super, super hard because you have to just keep going. Like you have to keep pulling layers off the onion until you get to the core of it. And I don't even know if onions have cores. But that's what's so difficult, right? So it depends on like what my task is for. I would say it's 3 things. What's my role as a host for that episode? What have I designed myself to be in that episode specifically? And that changes episode to episode. 2, what's the body of work for the guest? And then 3, how far back do I want to go based on the questions I want to ask, right? Because there are some questions or some topics that are just easier. You can ask more surface questions and still get really interesting answers. There are other ones where if you want to kind of dig a little deeper, you have to start peeling back that onion, and that can take hours of time. So I would say on average, my interview prep is about 10 hours, but that can go as low as 6 or as high as 16.
Wow. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, Michael.
It's all just to not sound like an idiot.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
I mean, it pays off. It pays off. You sound very thoughtful in each episode I've listened to, and it's clear that you care, which I think really goes a long way. But so I know you started, I think the first episode was released about September 2020. What was kind of like the exodus or like the reason for getting started? I know pandemic is when a ton of podcasts, came to fruition, but what's kind of your story for how that came to be?
Well, you've got half of it. I am extremely extroverted, and I was living alone in an apartment in Los Angeles where I live with my dog, and my dog is great. He is very friendly and loving, but he is not much of a talker. And so I was getting really stir crazy, and I wasn't seeing many of my friends for obvious reasons. And so that was one. And then two, at that time, I had become really frustrated with the ways that we were, or rather weren't, talking about what I thought and still think are rather important issues. Things around identity, race, like how we understand ourselves and how we understand each other. And I felt that, like, to go back to something that Jonathan Haidt talks about, is like I felt that like a lot of the ways that we were talking about these issues like weren't productive, and in many ways were anti-productive. Because I think that if you talk to the average person, like in private, in confidence and without like wanting to cast blame or aspersions and just wanting to understand people, a lot of the stuff's really messy, right? Like the way that we understand ourselves and the way that we understand other people are influenced by the things that we've been taught, the kind of the systems that we live in. And I don't mean that in like the kind of left-wing meme lord sort of way, but like we are all like kind of fish swimming in a school that we don't quite understand. And I find that like if we really want to tackle the hard problems, whether it's like racism, sexism, classism, etc., we have to talk about them in ways that aren't like univariable, right? Like that a single cause or a single event could be the explanation for every single way that we understand a complex topic. And I was getting really frustrated because I felt like, especially online, people are more addicted at calling each other names or calling each other out for wrongthink, rather than actually trying to get to the center of why we have problems or why there might be misunderstandings. And that doesn't mean that we have to lessen other people's pain or say that, oh, something like racism or classism or sexism doesn't exist. Of course it does. I think if you have eyes and ears, you've probably seen it in real life, in your own life. Yeah. But actually solving those problems means having to take a few extra steps beyond calling other people racists, right? Like you actually have to understand why they believe what they believe, why you believe what you believe. And I think having like a Spanish Inquisition style thing where we're all trying to be as pure as possible without actually trying to engender growth is a dead end.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally agree. Like the only way you're going to grow is to learn about each other, right? And go from there as far as gaining an understanding of everyone's worldview and their experiences, right? I guess a question leading from that is, do you have all these people on to kind of gain their perspective and learn about different topics that they have expertise on? What's something through those conversations that you have learned in your podcast, and something significant to you that you've learned in that experience in interviewing these people?
That's a great question. I would say that a lot of the learning comes in the prep, right? Like I think, even if I pretty much reach out to people I'm already fans of, but I'm fans of them for, like a thin slice of who they are as a human being, right? It's like, for instance, like it sounds like you guys have listened to a few episodes of the podcast, right? And it sounds like you like them, right? But if you were to do, if I had enough information about me online, and I'm not a super famous person, I'm not famous at all, frankly. So I don't have that much about me online, but a lot of the people that I reach out to, like, a lot of them exists on the internet, right? Mm-hmm. And so the version of them that I know when I reach out to them, and the version of them that I come to understand by the time I'm speaking with them is really two different people. It's like there's like 1,000 of each of you and 1,000 of me that exist, right? And I'll kind of elaborate. So I'm a brother to my sister, a son to my mother and father, a grandson to my grandmother, right? I'm a cousin, a niece, or not a niece. I'm a cousin, a nephew. I'm all kinds of things, right? Beyond that, like I'm hopefully a nice customer to the barista that I see every other day, right? But they only know me as that. So like in the software of their minds, like I'm hopefully like a nice guy who comes in and like asks a couple hopefully kind questions while I order my mocha, right? But like in their save state, in their brain's hard drive, like that's all that I am, right? So it's interesting to think about, and it's got kind of a rabbit hole you can go down if you think about it a little too much, which I am wont to do. But like there are 1,000 images of you, probably more than that, right? If you've met several thousand people over the course of your life. Like there's a friend, Elliott, I'm sure you had in middle school who you haven't seen since you both left middle school.
Yeah.
And you exist in that person's mind, frozen in time as a 12-year-old. So you're Elliott to them. They know that person, but you have become so much more in the last however many years since middle school. But that version of you exists there for all time. In the same way that there's a version of me just as a customer at a coffee shop in that barista's mind that will never change. But the thing is that whether you're frozen in time as a 12-year-old or as a customer at a coffee shop or as a scientist or as an actor or whatever, that's a tiny, 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 tiny little sliver of the full hard drive. And the only way that we can begin to learn more about each other is to get curious, and my job kind of requires me to be.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super interesting.
One thing I have to say, Michael, and this isn't so much a question as it is just a general observation. If ever there were someone born to interview and podcast, I think it would have to be you. Just based off of
I think so.
A couple observations. Curiosity, I think, is really important. I know there's that, I think it's a Walt Whitman quote, be curious, not judgmental. I think that's something you do really well. And I think that kind of gets to the core of something you deeply care about. And it's just creating a healthier dialogue between people. But also not just being curious, but just having a fucking clean voice. Like, I mean, Elliott, I don't know if you agree, but
I do. I mean, it does sound like his voice was given to him from the podcasting gods themselves.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Were you ever, before you got into it, did you ever have, friends, family that were like, this is something you need to do?
As a kid, especially once my voice dropped. Yeah, for sure. I've heard that before. People said I have a face for radio. No, I'm kidding. That's just one of my favorite jokes. But no, I have heard that. Yes, I have heard it. And it's interesting because this is just my voice, but I can really turn it on. Like you can, there's layers of it,
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen, for having me on this beautiful Saturday. But no, I guess people have said that. They're like, oh my gosh, you should do voice acting, right?
Yeah.
And I love that too. I love when people say that because I know it comes from a good place, but I know that it's ultimately meaningless because like having a good voice and being a good actor are two entirely different things.
Yeah. Very, very
separate. So I take the compliment, but I've had it happen for a couple decades now, and so I guess maybe I'm finally getting around to the calling that I was always intended to pursue.
Yeah,
good.
It's what you were meant for. I mean, but ultimately you make a good point, though. I mean, it's not all about the voice. I mean, people listen to your podcast because the content is good, right? It's not like, oh, this guy's got a fantastic voice. I have to keep listening. I got to keep listening to him.
It doesn't hurt though, right? I mean, could you imagine
it doesn't
if
hurt.
I was asking
It doesn't
the
hurt
exact
you.
same questions, but I sounded like this?
That's true.
Jonathan and Elliott, I just have to say that I really appreciate coming on. It's just been a fantastic, you ask really good questions. Thank you so much for the compliment, Jonathan.
I mean, could you imagine if that's if that's
I don't
who
know.
you were
I
listening
don't
to?
For seconds if you sounded like that.
There could be an audience for it, Michael. Maybe you should try to whip that one out on one of your
A
episodes.
smaller
and see how
one,
it goes.
I imagine, for sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Take it away, Elliott. Take it away.
I was just gonna say, so, I mean, in your podcast, you talk a lot about obviously what your guests are doing, what their expertise is in, but what's something that maybe your audience and obviously ours doesn't know about you that you're passionate about and Something maybe you do outside of podcasting that, yeah, like your audience wouldn't be familiar with because you don't talk too much about yourself on your podcast.
Excellent question. It reminds me of that joke. I don't know if you've seen it, where it's like, Waldo from Where's Waldo?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And there's like it's like a cartoon image of him like lying in a grass field, like looking up into the stars, and the writing in the panel says, everyone's always asking where's Waldo, but no one ever asks how's Waldo. And I thought that was fun. But yeah, what's something interesting about me outside of work? I will share for sure, but something that I learned as I started the podcast, and this is advice that I would give to anyone listening to this, is it took me until my like mid to late 30s to understand that there is a lot of value in having a hobby or something that you do that you enjoy, but that isn't always necessarily fun. Like, because before that, I first started out working in the film industry. I went to film school at USC, graduate film school at USC, to pursue film, worked on film sets for many years, directed some short films of my own, and then kind of fell into directing video game trailers, which is what I do now. And it's great work. It's fun. I get to not so much play video games. That's a misconception, but I get to work in some really popular video games and make, awesome images and work with really talented people. So that's really, really fun. But until this podcast, I'd either be working, 10, 12, 14, 16-hour days on either film sets or sometimes in video game work. And then I would come home and just do something fun, right? Like I'd watch a movie or, go on a date or go to the movies or go to a museum or play a board game or go out drinking, right? And that stuff's great, right? But what happened was, and I learned this way too late, is I would either be working or doing something fun. And so the ups and downs of work would have a much greater impact on me because all of my creativity and all of my effort was being funneled into a single thing, and much of that thing was beyond my control, right? Like, yeah, I can control like a little bit of like how I direct a game trailer, but I'm also serving clients. I'm serving people within the agency who are higher up than me, who have more creative experience than I do. There are always going to be things outside of my control, which might make the work hard or frustrating. And since all of my creative identity was being funneled into that single thing, it had so much more power over my emotions and over how I felt day to day. But now, since I've started the podcast, which again is a lot of work, it's about 30 hours per episode. If I'm including post and if I'm including booking and making audiograms and prep and editing and all that other stuff, it's a lot of work. I enjoy it. A lot of the time I don't enjoy it, even though I enjoy it in the macro when I'm like, 6 hours in on editing or like making an audiogram and the tech is frustrating. I'm not enjoying it. But what I enjoy is that my creative identity is now split across something that is largely outside of my control, the job I get paid for, that I enjoy, but is not a wholly selfish enterprise because it's not an army of one. And then my podcast, where I get to be totally 100% completely selfish. I get to choose exactly the guests I want to have on. I get to choose the topics I talk about. I get to choose how I edit it, make it sound as good as it can possibly be. I get to choose the audiogram. I get to choose when it's releasing. And what's been great about that from simply a therapeutic standpoint is that I care, like, and by care, I mean I'm emotionally less invested in a very healthy way. I care less about what happens at work because my creative identity isn't solely funneled into that one thing, which was probably never healthy in the first place. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question. But it's something philosophically that's been on my mind, and something I've only really realized in the last few months is how much less affected I am by the ups and downs of work because so much of my creative identity is now split across something in which I can wholly be selfish.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting because I feel like that's something that, I mean, I can't speak for Jonathan, but myself and with our own podcast, where it's like you're trying to find that balance, right, of your passions and hobbies and your full-time job and everything like that. And I mean, I feel like I went through almost like a quarter life crisis where you're trying to figure out, who am I? What am I doing with my life? What am I doing? And obviously we're still figuring that out. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good tool to spread your creativity and have a different outlet, man, and just have something else in your life where your passion and your efforts are going to. So I think that's Yeah, I feel like that's something that everyone can really relate to on some level.
We've talked about it before on the podcast, but I mean, that's kind of very similar to how our podcast got started, because I mean, granted, I wasn't exploring it as healthily and as like logically as you as you did. We were at my birthday party, and I was at a point where I was like, you know what, my job, which I do like at the end of the day, is, you know, kind of consuming me, and I don't really have anything else in my life that can kind of balance it out. And so, I mean, I was drunk. Elliott doesn't drink, so he's, you know, sober as you go for listening to me, and like, hey, we got to do something creative. We got to do something comedy. And so, you know, eventually it came to this. But I think you make a really, really, you know, salient point about, you know, about mixing creativity and splitting it so that, you know, it's not, you know, you're not putting all of your effort into one thing that's, you know, ultimately which you can't control. So very well said, I'll say.
Yeah. I mean, our podcast, like a lot of great things, can I say great, was born out of a drunken night.
True. I don't know if we can call it great yet, but
yeah, hopefully one day.
Yeah.
And to your earlier point, Jonathan, I think that there is something really important about having things in your life that give you a sense of control. I think my lack of a feeling of control at work is not a reflection on any one of the agencies that I've worked for, all of which have been, you know, varying degrees of awesome, right? But I'm a freelancer, so a lot of my life, you know, oftentimes is out of my control, and that, like, yeah, I'm kind of always waiting for the phone to ring. And, you know, there are things within my control. I hope I'm a good employee. I hope I'm putting out good work, which hopefully raises the percentage of chance that I'm going to get called. But a lot of that is kind of up in the air. And so I think that just having something in your life that isn't just purely fun, that gives you a sense of control and centers you, is of vital importance.
Wise words, Michael.
Well,
kind of getting back on.
I've got a couple of years on you.
Looking back at so as I was kind of cruising through the different episodes you have, specifically in your 64th episode, you got to interview the co-founder and co-CEO of Aptera Motors. So Elliott, I think I gave you like a brief talk about, but for people who are unfamiliar with Aptera, they're an EV company, specifically developing a car that is solar power, has solar charging, and the two main selling points are it can go 1,000 miles on a single charge, and, you know, for normal daily use, I think it's 40 miles without having to actually physically connect into it, just you know, strictly from solar charging, which is incredible. And I know in that podcast you mentioned that I think you had started following them around the same time that the idea for that company was, you know, initially conceived, which I think is late 2000s, if I'm not mistaken.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah, but it caught my eye because it's not a traditional EV. It does not look like a regular car. It looks more like almost like a Formula One racer. It's, you know, very kind of abstract when you compare it to like your Teslas. But I want to hear in your words how that conversation went, because that had to be super fun for you. I know you like EVs, and then also kind of where do you see the future of electric vehicles going, with like how things with Tesla are progressing, and then with also like these kind of, you know, more indie, I guess, startup companies like Aptera.
Well, I mean, it was super fun to talk with him because it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. And like I told Steve, I mean, Aptera was kind of my window into even thinking about EVs in this way. I mean, obviously, I think the Prius predated it, but that wasn't a pure EV. That was, you know, like a hybrid with a, you know, battery and a motor that still had to use gasoline most of the time. But one of the things that stood out to me about Aptera specifically, and to anyone listening to this episode, I highly recommend you just go look at the car, because it's got this kind of teardrop design with 3 wheels, 2 in the front, 1 in the back. And it just looks, you know, almost it has to be seen to be believed, to put it lightly. And I like people who think outside the box. And I'm like, oh wow, okay. Even back then, you know, the battery technology was not anywhere where it is today. And I think they had a hybrid model that was battery and gas, but could still go like hundreds of miles per gallon. And then they had a purely EV one, which I think got like 120 miles per charge, which was a lot back then. But I like people who, to go back to something I said earlier, try and think about things from a first principles perspective, right? And to try and think about, like, to put it another way, when I was speaking with Andy Lapsa from Stoke Space yesterday morning, literally, and he said that every design choice on the rocket that they're making right now, every single one is funneled through one goal. How do we make a rocket we can reuse 24 hours after we launch it? Every single goal. The goal, like every single thing, like how big is the rocket? What kind of fuel are we using? What kind of heat shield are we using? You know, like every single design choice, right? Like design choices that I can't even really grasp because I'm an idiot who hasn't been studying rockets for decades like Andy has. But I really love that, right? And if you look at like Elon Musk's work, or even Steve's work with Aptera, and you kind of scratch the surface a little bit, you can find out, like all of their design choices. To use another example, Steve Jobs famously, right? There's a story about the iPod, and the very first one, and he had simplicity in mind. He's like, look, MP3 players that come out right now suck. He's like, there's a reason that more people aren't buying them. They suck. They suck because they're not simple and they're not intuitive. So he gave his developers a challenge. He's like, I want to be able to, from the home screen and from anywhere that I'm at in the iPod, be able to get anywhere else and play a song in 3 clicks. So if I'm on the home screen of the iPod, I want to be able to play a song in 3 clicks. And his employees kept coming to him and they're like, well, but we have to, you have to go to the music genre, then you have to go to the album. Then he's like, I don't care. He's like, just find a way to make it work in 3 clicks. Now, looking back at this in 2023, you're like, well, yeah, that sounds like an easy problem. But you have to understand that at that time, if you look at other MP3 players, it was like 6 or 7 clicks, right? It was way less intuitive. And it can seem like almost a stupid or silly thing to get caught up on. But again, you just have to pick whatever your goal is, whether that's simplicity, 24-hour turnaround time, making an electric car sexy, whatever that might be, and then funnel every choice you make, no matter what that choice relates to, through that funnel. And you're like, okay, it's like an on-off switch. Is this making this product more simple or less? If it's more, I'll flip the switch. If it's less, I'm not going to do it. Is this design choice going to make it easier to turn this rocket around in 24 hours? Yes or no? Anything that doesn't help us do that one thing, I don't care about. And so that's what really interests me and excites me about something like Aptera, or something like Tesla, or something like SpaceX or Stoke Space, is people who are thinking with like a ton of clarity around solving a very singular problem and then funneling all of their effort through that one funnel. It's, I don't know, it's really exciting, and I like nerding out on it.
I honestly had not seen these Aptera cars before, and I just looked them up right now. They're insane. Like they look like I don't know if you've seen iRobot with Will Smith. It looks like those little cars they were driving in iRobot or something. Like, yeah, they look like futuristic as hell. You mentioned Elon Musk, and I know in your most recent episode with Tim Urban, you also mentioned being a fan of Elon Musk. Is Elon somebody you would want to have on your podcast? And if you did, what's something that you would want to ask him?
What's interesting is as much of a fan of his that I've been, I'm not, like, in the abstract, I would want to have him on, but I wouldn't want to have him on right now because I wouldn't know what to talk to him about. And by that, I mean, like there's people out there who I've been a huge fan of, or like people will come to me and this does not happen often. I'm not like some, mucky muck where people are coming to me with amazing guest recommendations. But I've had a couple of people come to me and they're like, hey, this person has like 10 million followers on Instagram or whatever. You want to talk to them? And like the selfish part of me wants to say like, yeah, of course, get a ton of exposure. I want to talk to him. But I'll say no because if I can't find an in that's going to interest me, so I can do 10 or 12 hours of research into that person, then I'm going to hate it. Like, I'm going to hate prepping for that interview. Yeah. And to go back to something I said earlier, I don't want to hate the thing that I started because I was frustrated with the work that was out of my control. Like, I never want to hate this podcast because if I hate it, then the very point of it has been lost. So for me, with someone like Musk, like if someone were to say like, hey, you want to talk to Musk right now, I don't know. It's only because he's been on so many other podcasts and so many other fantastic podcasters have asked him great questions. I just don't know what I could ask him that would add value. Like that would be additive. And I try and this sounds so up my butt, but it's the thing that helps guide me is I want to, if someone's been on a dozen podcasts, I want someone who's listened to all 12 of those to be able to listen to mine and still learn something. But that means that I have to find a way in, like with Richard Reeves, right? He wrote a book called Of Boys and Men. I think the subheading is Why the Modern Male is Struggling and What to Do About It, or How to Fix It. I can't remember exactly the subheading. He's a brilliant man. He works for the Brookings Institution. He's worked for several different governments in the UK and Canada. And he specializes in studying social inequality, right? And over the last few years, he's just been noticing a trend that a lot of men and young boys are falling behind in every Western society, whether it's the UK, America, Australia, New Zealand, etc. They're falling behind in undergrad, they're falling behind in grad school, they're falling behind in high school, middle school, elementary, in the workforce. You know, like 2 out of every 3 graduate students today are female. Now, is that in and of itself a problem? No. If people are getting an education and they're loving it, that's fantastic. But I think it might be a problem that a bunch of men just aren't pursuing that anymore, and we need to figure out why. Or like, why are men's salaries stagnating or falling while women's are rising? It's not a problem that women's salaries are rising. It might be a problem that men's salaries are failing. And so he started digging into it, right? And he learned a lot of great data about why it's happening, and he had some prescriptions on how to fix it. But he's been everywhere, guys. Like he's been on Breaking Points with Crystal and Sauger. He's been on Real Time with Bill Maher. He's been on NPR. He's been on the BBC, like interviewed by like really brilliant people. And so a lot of the prep that I was doing there, in addition to reading his book, was watching those other shows and being like, okay, well, like what, if I'm just going to ask him, pardon my French, because I don't curse on my own show. So I feel like I can let loose here.
Do it.
If I'm just going to ask him the same shit that everyone else has asked him, I should cancel the episode, right? Because I'm not adding anything, and his time is valuable. Like every minute he's spending talking to me is a minute he could be spending with his wife, is a minute he could be enjoying a nice walk through the English countryside or wherever he lives, right? Like he could be doing anything else but talking to me. And the listeners of the podcast could be listening to a better podcast that has already asked him the questions that I would ask him, right? Yeah. So for me, with someone like Richard, like my challenge that I gave myself was, how do I both onboard the listener who might not be familiar with Richard's work, right? So I can't be so meta about this conversation that I don't let the listener in on what the problems facing boys and men are and what his prescriptions are for them. So I can't completely throw the baby out. But can I find a way in that is unique, that hasn't been done? And what I found in listening to all these different podcasts with Richard on them is like, it was mentioned that he was a dad, but no one really like dug into what that meant. Like he dedicated the book to his 3 sons, right? He dedicated the book to his sons. He mentions his sons in his book. He talks about how important his sons are to him. And understandably, a lot of these podcasts are getting into like the meat of the numbers, right? Which makes sense. He has a lot of really scary numbers in the book. He's a smart guy. Mm-hmm. Talk to the smart guy about the numbers. But I also wanted to talk to him about like the why he wrote the book. And yeah, it could come from an abstract idea that he cares about men around the world. Sure. Like in the same way that I want everyone to live a happy life. But I know that he wrote the book because he has 3 boys. So for me, I wanted to start and end and throughout the episode, keep anchoring it back to the fact that he's a dad. And at the end of the episode, after we stopped recording, I got one of the most flattering compliments of my young podcast career, which is like, you've asked me questions on this show that no one has ever asked me before. And he's like, and that's a wild thing to say because I've been on like dozens of shows. Right. Yeah. Wow. Now, and I don't like, that was meaningful to me, not because it means that I'm some kind of brilliant guy. I'm attentive, right? Like I noticed a hole right? And so that makes me feel good. If I can talk to someone who's had a dozen interviews and ask them something unique, then I'll do it. I just don't know what that is with Elon Musk yet. I think if I had him on at this point in time, I'd probably berate him for the stupidest decision on planet Earth to buy Twitter and waste so much of his time on that stupid, cancerous hell site. Like every time he's tweeting is a minute he's not spending getting us to Mars, and that frustrates me.
Yeah.
But I don't think he'd enjoy that conversation.
I mean, I think you bring up a good point, and one of kind of my critiques of the emergence of social media over the last decade plus is that it is a good thing that people have a space to speak, but I think people confuse oftentimes just being able to speak isn't enough of a reason to speak, if that makes sense. Like
it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
For a long time, I mean, when I was young and like middle school and high school, like I got into every crap debate on Facebook and on Twitter. I wasn't adding any value. I wasn't changing anyone's minds. I was just constantly butting heads with people. And now I've kind of taken several steps back. My presence on social media is much has greatly diminished just over the past few years, because I tried to say, what, I am going to speak when I feel like I really truly have a reason to speak, and just maybe not flood the internet with shit people don't care about. So I like that you've kind of, especially with this Richard Reed interview, I like that you take what ultimately is just a very selfless approach, because you clearly care about quality, and you clearly care about being a good host. So I mean, I think that it's just part of my critique of social media as a whole. But I kind of wanted to ask you, there's thematically across all of your episodes, you'll talk about with various guests, like this growing social divide. Because if you have eyes and ears and every other sense, you can pretty clearly tell that there's been a change over the last decade. In that we have a society that you don't really get to disagree with people without 400 people on Twitter calling for your head. So I want to ask, like, in your opinion, what kind of was the initial cause of this? What's the exodus for this mass disagreement at all times, and what is the best way that we kind of bridge that gap going forward? How do we remedy it?
Great question. I'm not sure I know how to solve it, but maybe the solution is the same thing as what caused the problem. I think that stories are very powerful, right? And I think, and this is my own very quirky view, I think everything is a story, right? Like I think this podcast we're doing right now is a story. The questions you're asking, the answers I'm giving, that's a story. The story that you tell about your own family, right? Like, I don't know exactly what the stories of your individual families are, but I'm sure you were raised and you're like, and then grandpa did this, or our ancestors came over from here. And then, and you build stories that either have a positive or a negative light, or you tell stories of struggle. What do we do with that struggle? Did the struggle consume us? Did we overcome it? Right. And then you can tell stories also about bad situations that can still highlight something positive within that, right? Like you take someone who, like Martin Luther King when he's thrown in jail, you could, especially if you don't tell the rest of his story, you could be like, and then he was put in jail and it was awful, the end, right? As opposed to, and then he was put in jail, and the lessons that he learned while he was in that jail about perseverance and understanding his oppressor and understanding the need to show compassion, the things that he learned while he was incarcerated unjustly, that is a story that you can tell, even about a bad situation, right? Like how we choose to tell our own history, whether that's a personal history within our families, a history we tell about ourselves, right? Like something that's a big deal to me is cognitive behavioral therapy. I struggled and still occasionally do struggle with depression. I struggled with it very fiercely for many, many years. Did antidepressants, cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, all kinds of things. And depression is in many ways getting looped into a bad story and telling yourself a bad story over and over and over again, something that can be completely disconnected from reality, right? And there is a stat, I might not be getting the exact percentages right, so you might have to fact check me on it, but I think I'm roughly within a 1 or 2 percentage range. I think it might have been Pew. Like, they were asking white and black Americans how are race relations in America today? Like, do you feel good about how they're going? Do you feel bad? Like, what are your thoughts on it? And in 2003, black Americans, like 70% of them said that they felt pretty good about how race relations were trending. In 2003, that's 20 years ago, right? And I feel like we've made a lot of racial progress since then in terms of representation, in terms of average black median income, in terms of incarceration rates, in terms of educational attainment. Like, you can look, the numbers are there. Like, things are better, right? But this graph, starting with 2003, slowly starts trending downward, right? And then around 2012, 2013, it starts plummeting downward until now in 2023, again, with all the hard data that I have that can show that empirically things have gotten better. I think the average black American, only about 34% think that race relations are going well. So for me, that's an excellent example about how, regardless of how bad or good something is going, the story we tell ourselves about how it's going is actually more important than the hard data in some respects. Now what I'm not saying is, oh, well, even when things are going bad, tell a positive story. I think that's unjust. You don't want to say like, oh, things are going great. It's 1960 and you're black. It's great. Don't worry about it, right? But I think that the media does us a really, really terrible, toxic disservice if all they do is focus on the bad and increasingly rare instances of racial hatred or racial discord without highlighting all the progress we've made. I don't blame people for feeling like things are in the shitter, pardon my French again. If all we're doing is playing like the dozen horrific, really truly horrific cases of police brutality, but about a dozen of them in terms of unarmed people, unarmed men specifically, if we just play those 12 cell videos over and over and over again without highlighting the fact that 99.9% of all cop and human, like they're a different species, cop civilian interactions.
Might be.
I have cops in my family, so apologies for them. But if we don't highlight the cop civilian interactions, there's 50 million civilian police interactions a year. 50 million. And about like a couple dozen Americans of all races who are unarmed are killed every year. So it's not about not highlighting the bad stuff. If we can get that number to 0, I'd love to. But it alarms me that we're trending down from a place in 2003 when we had not made as much progress as we had today, where 70% felt we're on the right track, 70% of black Americans, and we're at 35% today. That's bad. And that, to me, shows the power of storytelling. I think the story we tell ourselves about as a people, as a nation, about progress, about justice, really, really matters. Because if we tell the wrong story, it can warp our reality to such an extent that we think the sky is red when it's blue.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's a good point.
Sorry about the rant.
Great. No, it's great. I love it. You're dropping so much knowledge on us, especially with the stats and stuff, Michael. You're coming with it today. But I wanted to ask one more question. I don't know if Jonathan has another one, but I did want to just
finish this off.
Yeah. I just wanted to lastly just talk about what your goals are for your podcast and for your career moving forward, and where do you see everything going, and what's the goal and the end game here for what you're trying to accomplish with your podcast?
Elliott, would you say you're asking me where we go next?
I may be asking where we go next.
So that's a great question. I think with the podcast, I try and stay present, and I try and keep myself interested in what I'm doing. And what that means, because I have it's hard for me to stay focused on any one topic for an extended period of time. I have so much admiration for people who are like, hey, this is a crime podcast and that's all we do. And we've been doing it for 6 years, every week, 52 weeks a year. God bless them, right? Like, God bless anyone who can do that. And I say that as an atheist. God bless anyone who can do that and not burn out, right? Like,
right.
Pete Davis, one of the guests that I had, he would call someone like that a long haul hero, right? Like the people who dedicate themselves to a single thing for a long period of time, rather that's community engagement, a podcast of one topic, teaching, a communal center, anything, right? Like the people who kind of build the foundations of our society by being reliable and being there for a long period of time. I have a lot of respect for people like that. I can't do it, right? Like I'm the type of person who I hear a song that I like, I listen to that song 8,000 times, and then I never listen to it again because I've made myself sick, Or I get obsessed with a movie or a topic, and I just dig, and then, okay, I think I'm going to vomit if I read another sentence of this. And so what I love about the podcast that I've created for myself is that I've made one that leans into what would be a problem in other places, right? Like if I just had a podcast that just talked about all the varieties of cheese in Wisconsin, I'd probably make 6 great episodes and then I'd retire because I would burn out. So if you look at the, okay, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say, could be a good topic to explore. I don't know. Maybe we think about a limited series, Michael. I don't know. Cheese in Wisconsin sounds fun.
That could be good. Although I feel like the episode on Swiss cheese might have some holes in it. But
okay, there we go. There we go.
But if you look at the podcast and you look at like the first couple dozen episodes, and then you look at the episodes that I'm doing now, you can notice a change in trajectory. And it's because at that point in time, I was a lot more interested in talking about things like racial inequality, the stories we tell ourselves about race and identity. Like, how do we understand each other? How do I understand myself? How do you understand yourself? Right? I did that for like a couple dozen episodes. And then I'm like, okay, it's not that I don't care about those topics anymore, but I am beginning to burn out. And I actually felt it one time. I won't say which episode because I want to respect that guest, but I could feel myself in the prep, right? Whereas had it been 6 months prior, I would have been like, oh, I'm so freaking excited to do this. I could feel myself in the prep being like, I don't want to do this. And this was a guest who was talented, accomplished, super senior where they were, an author, like all kinds of amazing things. I should be so grateful to talk to them. And I found myself hating the prep. And it had nothing to do with the guest. It had to do with the fact that I was burning out on the topic. And so what I love about the show is like now I'm like, oh, wow, it's really kind of fun talking to like founders of companies, like when they'll talk to me, like, because that's a fun story. But I bet if you were to check the podcast in 6 months, I probably won't be talking to any for a while because I'll probably be burnt out.
Yeah.
So the Where We Go Next title is a little meta because in one hand, it does kind of talk about that. Hey, where do we go next? Like as a society, where do we go next for rocket reusability? But it's also a commentary on the little quirk of how my mind works. Because I think I have some undiagnosed ADHD in that, like, after a little bit, I'm like, all right, where are we going next, guys? I'm getting a little bored. Where are we going? So for me, that's the thing that I love about the show is that I constantly have to stretch different parts of my brain. So thank God for that. But I'm just really blessed to be able to speak with such amazing, talented people. And it's just a real blessing. And so I want to thank past self for doing this for me. Because I'm way more grateful for this podcast than I ever could have possibly even known that I could be because of what it's given to me. So that's been a real blessing.
I mean, you're doing great work, and we hope you keep it up. And in 6 months, we'll check back in just to kind of see where you're at, and maybe you will be talking about cheese. But
do you mind if I ask 2 quick questions about your show? I know I don't want us to run too long. I want to respect your time, but I just 2 questions. One, what would you say like the thesis of your show is? What would you say your show is about at its core?
My stab at that, and it's funny because that is in so many words the same kind of questions that I'm sure Elliott got them, but when I would tell friends and families about them about this podcast we're making, they're like, so what is it about? And my answer to that is nothing really. It's not that we're near on the same scale, but my sister-in-law described it as kind of like Seinfeld in that it's a show about nothing, but there's still some entertainment to it. And so I would say it's just a conversation between 2 friends. And that's really all there is to it. I mean, I think now we're going to try to get more into bringing people on and hearing their stories. And But I mean, I think that's where we're at, Elliot.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. The original goal of the podcast was essentially just, two friends sitting down and having a chat and having open conversations, having some laughs along the way. But I think the cool thing that we've discovered about podcasting is it's kind of developing and forming itself into what it is, right? It's its own show. And at this point, we're just kind of like, this is what the show is. So, and we're kind of diving now more into interviewing and getting people's stories and understanding other people's point of view to kind of add a different aspect to it. But yeah, I mean, the original goal was to just have an open conversation with some friends, and if people are listening to it, they can be a part of the group as well. So yeah, I mean, as far as what it's about, like he said, it's sort of like a still forming that that I guess still discovering what that really is. But yeah, we're along the journey and we're loving it. So
we really felt that there was like a true lack of two white guys talking to each other for an hour a week. So we wanted
there's a hole in the market.
Well, I think to something you said, Elliot, I think you might have touched on this as well, Jonathan. It's like, it's totally fine in my view to figure out what the show is like as you go. And because, and the nice thing here too is, and I say this about my podcast as well, in the grand scheme of things, no one is listening, right? Like, and I mean that in like the best way possible. There are 7 billion people on planet Earth. Even if you have 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 people listening to your show, that's no one, right? And but what's empowering about that is that because no one's listening, you can pivot or change or grow or evolve at any time, and no one will know unless they do. And almost no one listens to like back episodes unless you're prepping to interview someone and you're like, oh, let me go back and listen to those. Most people don't. So the episode that they first like come on board with is the episode that they will think your podcast has always been. And so that's been something, that's a story. Speaking of stories, that's a story I tell myself all the time. Because sometimes I'll go back and I'll listen to an earlier episode and I'll be like, I could have been better, or I would have asked a different question now had I been me, and the impossible question. But no one cares, which is so empowering. No one cares. Like there's so much power and understanding, like just general apathy, that like anyone outside of your immediate circle just doesn't care about you. But that is so empowering. Like it's done such like such great work for like my own self-image and like how I feel about myself, because I struggle with like body issues and stuff. And so like, I'm like, oh, everyone's looking at me and how out of shape I am and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no one cares. And that's true for creative works too. So that's been really helpful for me.
Yeah, I totally agree.
I mean, yeah, discovered this. I mean, when we first started, like, had anxieties about everything. And then I think we've just reached a point where I was like, you know what? If we just have a week where the energy's not there, the episode's not that great, it's like, well, it's just our friends and family and occasional strangers that are tuning in. If they've got this far, I don't think they're going to be super discouraged from listening if we don't rise to a certain quality. But I think you're absolutely right in that.
Yeah, Megan Daum, former guest of the show, a brilliant author and host of the Unspeakable podcast, she gave some really great wisdom to me too. She said not all your episodes are going to be great. Like they're just not. Like sometimes you're going to have on a guest that's just kind of a flop, or maybe you're just not going to have enough time to prep, or you ask questions and the answers aren't that interesting, or any host of reasons why the episode isn't that good. And she was like, if you try and make every episode perfect, you will drive yourself insane. You have to make peace with the fact that some are just going to be fine, but that like the greater quilt of all of the work together, you hope that that's great, but like, it's okay. Like if you have a quilt that has like 1,000 patches on it, it's okay if you have some shit patches. The most important thing is to keep stitching. But my one other question for you guys with maybe like one addendum, and you may have spoken about this on the podcast and I may just not have heard it. What's the history of the name and what does it mean?
Yes. So we went through seveul. I mean, we had a couple brainstorming sessions.
Oh, so many stupid names that could
a lot
have
of
come
really
out of this
really
podcast.
stupid names. But it actually came, oddly enough, it came from a Twitter handle or not a Twitter handle, but like a Twitter description that I had for several years. And so, if you know me, you know that I like I enjoy like self-deprecating humor. I like belittling myself, knocking myself down a few pegs. And I can't really remember exactly what drove me to do it. And just in my description, I just said something like I'm impossibly unremarkable, like incredibly uninteresting, something like that. And so when we were looking for, like, we went through so many different iterations and like tried to include the word pod in the name of the title, and everything just sucked. And I just happened, I was like looking on Twitter and I saw, I looked at my description again because I haven't been very active on Twitter for several years now, but I'm like, impossibly unremarkable. That's not half bad. And then I told it to him and he's like, yeah, let's do it. So
I think that really spoke to kind of the vibe that we wanted to, because it's like, we wanted it to be a comedy podcast, right? But we're just two people. We're not like remarkable in any way. So we're just two guys chatting, having laughs, and we're not anything remarkable or anything to I don't know, I guess put on a pedestal in any way, but it kind of spoke to who we are and what we wanted it to feel like. Like we're just two dudes,
Yeah.
Well, if you'll allow me, speaking as someone who has enjoyed our conversation and thought you both were great hosts, if you'll allow me to share two small anecdotes, and then I'll let you go. The first one is that I too, oftentimes, I'm a little better about it now, but throughout my childhood and young adulthood, I think partially out of crippling insecurities, again, speaking of therapy, a lot of my humor was self-deprecating. And an ex-girlfriend of mine, wise as she was, at one point, I think early on in our relationship, said, she said, can you stop doing that? She was like, can you stop making jokes about yourself that like knock yourself down? Because, and the next thing she said really left an impact on me. She said, because I don't think of you that way. And every time you make a joke, it starts to change my view of you. And I don't like losing how I think of you. And I don't like my view of you being tainted by how you view yourself. And she was like, because I think you're, and then she gave me all these compliments and whatever. She's like, that's how I see you. And I understand if you don't see yourself that way, but I don't want your view to corrupt mine. And that like really left an impact on me. And the other anecdote I'll share, and this is more recent with my current girlfriend, who is amazing, who I love very much. She is sometimes a little insecure about her cooking, right? And so she would say, so she'll say like, hey, here's this XYZ dish and it's not good. And I just asked her, I said, look, it might not be good. Now, granted, she's never cooked anything that I haven't enjoyed that hasn't been really great. I was like, look, this dish you're about to serve me might not be good. Okay, I'll allow you that. But can you wait until after I've finished eating it before you tell me how shitty you thought it was? Just let me go in clean, right? And of course, every time I eat it, is it going to win like a 3 Michelin star award? No, nothing I ever cook's going to either. But in terms of like a home cooked meal, I clean every plate she gives me. I clean every single one. And I'm not talking about cleaning it in the sink. So again, I've had a really great time. Thank you for listening to my anecdotes. You guys have been great hosts, and thank you for letting me jabber on.
Yeah, this has been really enlightening, and it comes across in the podcast, but even more so in this conversation, just how thoughtful and wise you are. So we've appreciated having you. Why don't you take some time to just tell everyone, all the thousands of people that are listening to this specific episode, tell them what you're doing, where they can find you, what you're up to.
Yes, to the thousands listening to the Impossibly Unremarkable podcast, and specifically the friends and family of Jonathan and Elliott. Where we go next is a podcast about in-depth conversations with fascinating guests who are very qualified in their fields and who I am blessed to speak with. You can find Where We Go Next on pretty much any podcast platform, or if you go to wherewegonext.com. I recently designed a website in Squarespace that I obsessed over because I'm a perfectionist, and I still think it doesn't live up to my standards, but it's just about letting go. So wherewegonext.com, the episode that I have coming out a couple days from now, which probably will be in the past by the time this podcast is released, I have a wonderful man by the name of Samba Shoot. He is an actor on Our Flag Means Death on HBO. He is a stand-up comedian. He is very, very funny. And we had a great conversation about his history, his background, growing up in Ethiopia to a Mauritanian mother and Dutch father, becoming a stand-up comic in Holland, and then moving to Hollywood and having to start over, eventually getting a job on Our Flag Means Death and the success of that show. And it's just a great conversation. So yeah, I mean, every episode is different. You never know what you're going to get. And you might not enjoy all of them, but I can guarantee you'll probably enjoy at least part of one. So yeah, thanks again for having me on, guys. Hopefully that's a decent summary.
That's great. That's great.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much again for being on. One last thing from you. We always like to have our guests leave our audience with some words of wisdom. I know you have already bestowed a lot of wisdom on us today, but what's one last thing you can leave our audience with to live their lives by?
Well, I was just listening to Ryan Holiday. He is the founder of the Daily Stoic, and I've been reading some of his books lately about Marcus Aurelius and the other famous Stoics, Epictetus. And he just mentioned an author by the name of Robert Caro, who is a biographer, and he has a series of books, biographies, a series of biographies about Lyndon Johnson. And I think in that book, Robert Caro says, "Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals." And the wisdom there is that, like, however powerful or weak you are, your character stays. So if you're a terrible person with very little power, there's not much you can do. But a terrible person who gains a lot of power can do a lot of terrible things. But a good and kind-hearted person, with or without power, is the same person. The idea being that power doesn't corrupt you. Power just shows us who you've been all along. And I thought that insight was really powerful. So I hope you find it so as well.
I did.
I did. Awesome. Thank you again for coming on. We appreciate it. And yeah, awesome.